begins with the kind of story towns whisper about, only when the lamps are low and the doors are locked. A tale too shameful, too cruel, for polite voices to ever speak aloud. They say a young girl in America's forgotten countryside did the unthinkable. She buried her parents alive and stayed long enough to hear their final breath. But the deeper question is why, and what terrible secrets would push blood to betray blood in such a monstrous way. Hi everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before this story pulls you in too deep. Because tonight, we unravel a story stitched together from fragments of history, from rumors and hidden testimonies. A story the town swore to bury, just as the daughter buried her own flesh and blood. It was the summer of 1949 when the first threads of suspicion began. The family lived in a weathered farmhouse, standing alone on the edge of vast wind-swept fields. To the outside world, they appeared unremarkable, quiet, reclusive, carrying themselves with the strained politeness of people hiding something. Their daughter, barely 16, had a gaze that unsettled even the kindest of neighbors. She was pale, withdrawn, her eyes carrying a strange mixture of sorrow and defiance. Whispers spread about what went on behind those walls. Arguments heard in the night, shouts quickly silenced. The father's shadow lingering near the barn at odd hours, the mother's face always marked with worry. People pretended not to see, because in small towns, silence is the strongest currency. And so, the years wore on, and whatever secrets rotted inside that house festered deeper. But by the time the girl acted, the outcome was already sealed. Those who later pieced together the fragments described her as calm, disturbingly calm, when she led her parents into the yard under the pretense of work. She dug the pit herself, her hands blistered and raw, and yet no one suspected what she intended. When the earth finally swallowed them, when their muffled cries seeped into the soil, the daughter stood over the grave and did not flinch. To some, it was madness. To others, it was justice. And still, the question lingers like smoke in the air. What truth could drive a child to bury her own blood alive? The police reports, what little remains of them, tell a story stripped of feeling, a cold recitation of facts. Yet the neighbors' accounts reveal something darker, a pattern of fear stretching back years. They recalled how the girl's parents were strict beyond measure, their discipline more cruelty than guidance. Windows rattled with the sounds of arguments, and once, in winter, a neighbor swore she saw the girl locked outside, barefoot in the snow, punished for reasons she dared not ask. When questioned, townsfolk admitted to seeing bruises, sudden changes in the girl's demeanor, but they said nothing. Silence was easier. It was the 1940s after all, a time when family matters were kept behind closed doors, no matter how sinister. That silence built a cage of its own, a cage that tightened until it broke. The girl began to change. Teachers described her as distant, her notebooks filled with dark drawings, coffins, gravestones, eyes watching from the corners of pages. At church, she sat stiff as stone, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her skin. People whispered that she was possessed, that the devil had crept into her heart. But perhaps what they mistook for possession was something else entirely. A desperate mind, quietly plotting escape from a home that offered no mercy. The fateful night has been retold in fragments, but one detail remains consistent. The girl did not hesitate. She lured her parents outside under the pretense of needing help with chores. The pit she had dug waited silently in the darkness. Witnesses later said she hummed under her breath, an old lullaby her mother used to sing. When the first shovelful of dirt struck the air above them, she looked down with eyes as empty as the grave itself. By dawn, she sat alone in the farmhouse kitchen, her dress caked in soil, her hands shaking yet strangely composed. When the sheriff arrived, summoned by an anonymous call, she did not run. She pointed to the yard, and when they unearthed the truth, some officers turned away, unable to stomach the sight. Her words, however, were colder than the grave she dug. "They can't hurt me anymore." But was this the cry of a broken child, or the chilling declaration of something far darker? The trial that followed was unlike anything the county had ever seen. Courtrooms were usually reserved for theft, disputes over land, maybe the occasional drunken brawl. But now, the townspeople crowded inside to witness a girl accused of burying her parents alive. The benches groaned under the weight of gossip, fear, and a morbid kind of fascination. Some came seeking justice. Others came simply to watch the spectacle. The girl sat in silence throughout much of the proceedings. She wore a plain dress, her hair hanging loosely around her pale face, and though her eyes remained fixed on the floor, there was an aura about her that unsettled even the hardened sheriff. When the charges were read, she did not weep. When the details of her parents' final moments were spoken aloud, she showed no tremor. It was as though she had already lived those words long before anyone else dared to speak them. The defense argued that she had suffered years of abuse, that what she had done was not an act of cruelty, but an eruption of desperation. Neighbors reluctantly took the stand, confessing to what they had seen, the bruises, the locked doors, the screams muffled by night. Yet with every testimony, shame clung to their voices, for they had seen and done nothing. The prosecution, however, painted her as cold-blooded, a remorseless child capable of premeditated evil. They showed the shovel, the bindings, the deliberate act of digging a pit before luring her parents to it. It was not rage, they said, but calculation. Newspapers seized upon the story, their headlines dripping with horror. Daughter turns gravedigger. Parents buried alive in farmyard nightmare. The public could not look away. Some vilified her as a monster born from hell itself, while others pitied her as a victim pushed beyond the edge of sanity. For weeks, the county became the epicenter of a macabre debate. Was she the face of evil, or a reflection of evil done to her? But the most haunting part of the trial came not from the testimonies or the arguments, but from the girl herself. When finally asked why she did it, she raised her head for the first time, her voice steady and chilling. "I wanted to hear the earth take them." No one in the courtroom forgot those words, and some swore they still heard them echoing in their dreams for years after. After the trial ended, the girl's fate was sealed in a way that seemed both inevitable and unsatisfying. She was declared guilty of murder, though the verdict came with hesitation, as though the jury themselves could not fully decide what kind of monster or victim she really was. Instead of the gallows or the chair, she was sentenced to life in confinement, a decision that split the town straight down the middle. Some called it mercy. Others whispered it was cowardice. But the story did not end with her conviction. In many ways, it only began there. For decades, she became a shadowy figure, locked away in an institution that smelled of bleach and rust, where the walls were as gray as the souls trapped inside. Staff records from the asylum describe her as eerily composed, a patient who rarely spoke, but whose presence made others uneasy. She spent hours drawing on scraps of paper, always the same images: graves, hands clawing through dirt, eyes peering up from the soil. Doctors debated her condition endlessly. Was she psychotic? Traumatized? a survivor of horrors no one dared to acknowledge. Some claimed she lacked empathy, that she carried the void of a sociopath. Others said she was simply the product of cruelty, passed down like a curse through generations. But what chilled them most was her indifference to time. Whether days or years passed, she remained the same, silent, pale, and unflinching, as if waiting for something. Meanwhile, the town outside tried desperately to bury its shame. The farmhouse was left to rot, its windows broken by storms, its walls collapsing in on themselves. Children dared each other to step inside, swearing they heard voices beneath the floorboards. Older generations refused to speak her name. Families moved away, and those who remained grew bitter at how their home had been stained forever by one girl's act. And yet, whispers persisted. A janitor at the asylum claimed that late at night, he heard her singing, a soft lullaby muffled by the walls. Farmers nearby swore the earth around the abandoned property never grew crops again, as if the soil itself had swallowed too much. Whether truth or superstition, the story refused to die. It clung to the town like ivy, winding deeper with each retelling. Because some wounds cannot be healed, they fester, they rot, and they whisper their truths long after the people are gone. The years passed, and still her story refused to fade. Generations later, grandchildren of the original townsfolk would stumble upon fragments. Yellowed newspaper clippings, tucked inside forgotten trunks, brittle trial transcripts left in attic boxes, photographs whose edges curled like burnt paper. Each discovery reignited questions that had never truly been answered. One of the most disturbing artifacts unearthed was a series of drawings believed to be hers, smuggled out of the asylum by an orderly. They depicted not only the burial of her parents, but other, stranger scenes. Children with hollow faces staring from beneath the ground, families standing stiffly together while their feet disappeared into earth, and endless graves. Historians who studied them claimed the images weren't simply delusions, but perhaps coded memories, things she had seen or endured long before her parents' deaths. Was it possible the parents themselves were keepers of older, darker secrets? Had the girl inherited more than just pain from that household? Some suggested that the family line was tainted, that rumors of inbreeding and cruelty stretched back further than anyone dared admit. The town's archives were strangely empty, as though entire chapters had been erased. Land records disappeared. Church registries went missing. It was as if history itself was conspiring to hide what lay beneath that soil. Meanwhile, the girl, now a woman, remained in confinement. Nurses described her as aging without ever softening. Wrinkles carved into her face, but her eyes stayed sharp, unyielding, fixed always on something unseen. One nurse, in a diary found years later, wrote, "When she looks at you, it feels as if she is measuring how long you could breathe under the dirt." And though decades separated her from the act, she never spoke of remorse. No apology, no explanation beyond that chilling sentence from the trial. "I wanted to hear the earth take them." It is this absence of resolution that makes her story so haunting. For in every crime, we seek meaning, an answer that closes the wound. But with her, the wound only widens. Perhaps that is why her story lingers in hushed voices and restless dreams. It is not only what she did, but the silence that followed, that refuses to let the living rest. By the 1970s, the story had twisted into folklore. Teenagers whispered it on back roads, daring each other to visit the crumbling farmhouse where the act had begun. Local legends grew, turning fact into nightmare. They said if you pressed your ear to the soil on that land, you could still hear muffled screams beneath the earth. Others claimed to have seen her shadow in the broken windows of the house long after she had been locked away. Yet while myths blossomed, there were still fragments of truth to be uncovered. A set of letters, believed to be written by her mother before the burial, surfaced in a private collection. The letters spoke of a family secret, of debts owed not to moneylenders, but to bloodlines, of curses spoken in whispers at night. Though vague, they hinted at cycles of violence and control, of a household shaped not by love, but by inherited cruelty. It raised a chilling question. Was the daughter's act truly born from her own mind, or was she the final echo of generations steeped in silence and sin? Meanwhile, records from the asylum grew more disturbing. Staff reported that even in her old age, she never strayed from her obsession with soil. She kept jars of dirt under her bed, scooped from the asylum gardens. She sifted it through her fingers during therapy sessions, staring at it, as if listening. More than one nurse resigned after witnessing her behavior, claiming that she spoke to the earth as though it spoke back. And then, in 1983, she died quietly in her sleep. No relatives came to claim her body. The institution buried her in an unmarked grave, her name reduced to a number on a ledger. For most, that was the end. But for the town, her shadow lingered. The abandoned farmhouse collapsed into ruin, but children still swore they felt watched when they passed it. The soil in that yard remained bare, no grass daring to grow. The community tried to erase her memory, but some stains are too deep to wash away. And so her name, her act, her silence, all of it became part of an inheritance the town could not refuse. It is one thing to forget a crime. It is another to live under the weight of a story that refuses to die. Her grave may be unmarked, but her story carved itself into the marrow of the town. Decades later, researchers, writers, and morbidly curious strangers still chase after the fragments, piecing together what truth might be found among the ruins. Each time the story resurfaces, it feels less like a tale of one girl and more like a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of human nature. For some, she remains a monster, an image of cold-blooded cruelty, a daughter who buried her parents alive and listened to them suffocate. For others, she is a victim of cruelty so relentless that the act becomes less about murder and more about liberation. The truth, perhaps, lies in the space between those views, in a gray place where love curdles into hate and survival becomes indistinguishable from vengeance. But what haunts most is not just the act itself, but how it reveals the silence of the people around her. Neighbors who heard screams but said nothing. Teachers who saw bruises but turned away. A town that chose not to see until it was too late. In the end, was she the only guilty one? Or was the entire community complicit, burying the truth in silence long before she buried her parents in soil? There are no clear answers, and maybe that is why the story refuses to rest. It lingers because it forces us to confront the ugliest truth of all, that sometimes evil is not a single act, but a legacy, passed down, ignored, and hidden until it erupts. That a single child can become both executioner and evidence of what silence breeds. Today, when people speak of her, it is in hushed tones, like a ghost story no one dares to finish. They say if you visit that land on a quiet night, you can hear a lullaby on the wind, the same one she hummed as the dirt covered her parents. Whether you believe it or not, one thing is certain: the earth remembers what we try to forget. And so her story, Remikoi, Ains buried, but never gone, surfacing again and again like bones rising through the soil after a storm.